I still remember the weight of that manila folder in my hands, the way the fluorescent lights of the Denny's where I was conducting informal interviews cast shadows across the cheap laminate table. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was already on my third cup of coffee, trying to stay awake after another sleepless night reviewing applications for our expanding team at Patterson & Associates Insurance. The folder contained what looked like dozens of resumes, each one representing someone's hope, someone's future, someone's trust that we might see something in them worth investing in. But this particular resume, buried somewhere in the middle of the stack, belonged to a young man named Tyler Chen, and neither of us knew that day how deeply our professional paths would intertwine, how much confidence I would place in him, or how devastating the betrayal would eventually become. The coffee shop was nearly empty, except for a few truckers grabbing breakfast before hitting the road again, their conversations mixing with the clatter of dishes and the hum of the old air conditioning unit. I had chosen this place specifically because it was neutral ground, somewhere less intimidating than our corporate office for candidates who might be nervous about their first real professional opportunity. Tyler's application had caught my attention not because of his credentials, which were admittedly thin, but because of the handwritten note at the bottom, where he explained that he had been working 2 jobs to support his younger sister through college while finishing his own degree. There was something raw and honest about that vulnerability, something that spoke to the part of me that remembered being young and desperate for someone to take a chance on me in the professional world. When Tyler walked through that glass door, I could see the nervousness radiating from him like heat waves off summer asphalt. He was wearing a suit that had clearly been borrowed or purchased from a thrift store, the sleeves just a bit too long, the shoulders not quite fitting right, but he had pressed it carefully, and his shoes were polished to a shine that spoke of preparation and respect for the opportunity. His handshake was firm, but his palms were sweaty, and when he sat down across from me in that cracked vinyl booth, I could see him trying to control his breathing, trying to project confidence he didn't quite feel yet. What struck me most was how he looked me directly in the eyes when he spoke, even when discussing his limited experience, even when admitting what he didn't know. There was an authenticity there, a willingness to be vulnerable and honest that I had learned to value more than polished presentations or impressive degrees. The conversation flowed more naturally than I had expected, moving from his academic background to his goals, from his understanding of the insurance industry to his thoughts on customer service and building relationships. Tyler spoke about loyalty like it was a fundamental principle, not just a buzzword, explaining how he had stayed with his part-time job at a local grocery store for 3 years because he believed in honoring commitments and building trust with colleagues and customers alike. He talked about learning from mentors, about the importance of guidance, and how he hoped to find someone in the professional world who would invest in his growth the way his high school guidance counselor had invested in encouraging him to pursue higher education. When I asked him about his long-term goals, he didn't give me some rehearsed answer about climbing the corporate ladder, but instead spoke thoughtfully about wanting to become the kind of professional who could mentor others, who could create opportunities for people like him who just needed someone to believe in their potential. As I watched him carefully tear open 2 sugar packets for his coffee, his hands still trembling slightly with interview nerves, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years of hiring decisions. It was that moment when you recognize something of yourself in another person, when you see potential that others might overlook, when you realize you have the power to change someone's trajectory simply by saying yes instead of no. Tyler represented everything I believed about giving people chances, about looking beyond the surface qualifications to see character and determination, and the hunger to learn and grow. The professional environment had taught me to value loyalty and trust above almost everything else, and sitting across from this young man who spoke about commitment and gratitude with such sincerity, I felt convinced that I had found someone who would not only succeed in our organization, but would do so with the kind of integrity that had become increasingly rare in the business world. By the time we finished our conversation and I walked him to the parking lot, I had already made my decision, though I didn't tell him that day. I watched him drive away in an old Honda Civic that had seen better days, the muffler loud enough to announce his departure to half the strip mall, and I felt a sense of anticipation that I hadn't experienced in months. The frustration of dealing with corporate politics and the disappointment of watching other promising hires fail to live up to their potential had left me somewhat cynical about the whole process. But Tyler had rekindled something in me. He had reminded me why I had gotten into management in the first place, why I believed in the power of mentorship, and the importance of creating opportunities for others to succeed. As I sat in my car for a few minutes before heading back to the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that this hire would be different, that this young man would justify my faith in him, and perhaps even exceed my expectations. The afternoon I called Tyler to offer him the position. I could hear the emotion in his voice even though he was trying to maintain his composure. He thanked me 3 times in the span of 30 seconds, and when I explained that I saw potential in him that others might miss, he told me that no one had ever said anything like that to him before. That moment of genuine gratitude, that recognition of the opportunity being offered, convinced me that I had made the right choice. What I didn't know, couldn't have known, was that this same young man who spoke so eloquently about loyalty and commitment would eventually become the center of a workplace betrayal that would fundamentally change how I viewed trust in professional relationships. But that story was still months away from unfolding. The morning director James Morrison walked through our office doors for the first time. I was reorganizing the supply closet near the reception area, a task that had become my unofficial responsibility over the years because I believed in maintaining order and taking care of the details that others overlooked. It was a humid Thursday in July, and the building's ancient air conditioning system was struggling to keep up with the heat, creating that stale, recycled air feeling that made everything seem slightly off-kilter. Morrison arrived with an entourage of corporate executives from the main office, their expensive suits and polished shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floors as they conducted what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated tour of our facility. I watched from my position near the supply closet as he shook hands with several of my male colleagues, engaging them in conversations that seemed to extend well beyond the typical pleasantries, while his eyes seemed to skip over the women in the office, as if we were part of the furniture rather than integral members of the team. The pattern became clear within the first week of his tenure, manifesting itself in ways that were subtle enough to make you question your own perceptions, but consistent enough to create a growing sense of unease in the professional environment. Every morning I would arrive at the office around 7:30, parking in the same spot in the employee lot behind the building, and I would make it a point to greet colleagues as I walked through the hallways toward my office. Morrison's routine involved arriving around 8:15, stopping at the coffee station near the main entrance, and then making his way through the office, acknowledging various team members with either a nod, a handshake, or a brief conversation about weekend plans or current projects. What became increasingly apparent was that his greetings followed a distinct pattern based on gender, with male colleagues receiving warm good morning salutations and often being asked about their thoughts on various business matters, while female employees were met with either complete silence or, at best, a barely perceptible nod that suggested tolerance rather than respect. I decided to test this theory systematically, approaching Morrison on 3 consecutive mornings with cheerful greetings and observations about the day or upcoming projects, only to be met with uncomfortable silence or brief acknowledging grunts that contrasted sharply with the animated conversations I observed him having with Tyler and other male team members in the break room. The frustration of being consistently overlooked began to eat away at my confidence, making me question whether I was being overly sensitive or whether this was indeed a deliberate pattern of behavior that reflected deeper issues with how Morrison viewed female professionals in the workplace. The environment that had once felt collegial and supportive began to feel charged with tension, as if there were invisible barriers being erected based on criteria that had nothing to do with competence, experience, or contribution to the organization's success. During team meetings, Morrison's behavior became even more pronounced, with interruptions that seemed strategically timed to undermine female voices while allowing male colleagues to complete their thoughts and receive positive feedback for their contributions. I would begin presenting quarterly reports or analysis that I had spent hours preparing, only to be cut off mid-sentence by Morrison, redirecting the conversation to male colleagues, who were asked to elaborate on points that were often less substantial than what I had been attempting to present. The professional environment that had once felt like a meritocracy began to feel like a stage where performance was being evaluated based on factors that had nothing to do with actual performance, where loyalty and competence were being overshadowed by gender dynamics that seemed to favor those who matched Morrison's apparent preferences for collaboration and communication. The breaking point came during a particularly important client presentation where Morrison referred to me as the woman from accounting, despite the fact that I had been introduced to him multiple times and had been working directly with him on the project for several weeks. The humiliation of being reduced to a generic descriptor, rather than being recognized as an individual professional with a name and specific expertise, was compounded by the fact that Tyler, who had been working under my guidance on the same project, was referred to by name and complimented on his attention to detail and fresh perspective on issues that we had developed together during our mentoring sessions. The disconnect between Morrison's treatment of male and female employees became so obvious that even some of the male colleagues began to notice, though none of them felt comfortable enough to address it directly. What made the situation particularly painful was watching Tyler begin to mirror Morrison's behavior, slowly adopting similar patterns of interaction that seemed designed to align himself with the new director's preferences and communication style. The young man who had once expressed such gratitude for mentorship and guidance was now gravitating toward Morrison's inner circle, participating in conversations and decisions that increasingly excluded the female members of the team who had been instrumental in his professional development. The loyalty that I had believed was genuine began to feel more like a temporary convenience, something that could be discarded when more advantageous relationships became available. As Morrison's influence grew within the organization, I began to realize that the professional environment I had worked so hard to contribute to was being fundamentally restructured according to preferences and biases that had nothing to do with merit or results. The frustration of being consistently overlooked and undervalued was beginning to affect not just my work performance, but my overall sense of professional identity, making me question whether the investment I had made in building relationships and mentoring others had been naive or misguided. Yet what troubled me most was not Morrison's behavior itself, but the way it was beginning to influence others in the organization, creating a culture where recognition and advancement seemed increasingly tied to factors that had nothing to do with actual contribution or competence, and where the bonds of trust and loyalty that had once defined our workplace were being slowly eroded by the introduction of new dynamics that favored conformity over character. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but like watching a slow-motion car accident, I could see every devastating detail as it unfolded before my eyes in the cramped break room of our office building. Tyler had always been someone who absorbed information quickly, a quality that had made him such an effective learner during his first months on the job. But I began to notice that his learning had taken on a different focus entirely. Instead of asking me questions about client management or industry best practices during our usual coffee breaks at the vending machine near the water cooler, he started repeating phrases and concepts that were clearly lifted from Morrison's management philosophy, speaking about strategic realignment and optimizing human resources in ways that felt rehearsed and artificial. The confidence that had once seemed genuine and earned through hard work was being replaced by a borrowed swagger that mimicked Morrison's communication style, complete with the same dismissive gestures and the same tendency to interrupt others mid-sentence when they were presenting ideas that didn't align with his newly adopted worldview. The first time Tyler publicly contradicted me was during a team meeting in the small conference room that smelled perpetually of stale coffee, an industrial carpet cleaner, where we were discussing the implementation of a new client tracking system that I had been developing for several months. I was explaining the rationale behind certain features when Tyler interrupted me to suggest that my approach was too complicated, and that we should consider a more streamlined solution that would eliminate unnecessary complexities. The language was pure Morrison, delivered with the same tone of condescending authority that our new director used when he wanted to establish dominance in a conversation. What made the moment particularly painful was not just the public contradiction, but the way Tyler looked directly at Morrison for approval after delivering his critique, seeking validation from the man who had become his new model for professional behavior. Rather than engaging with the substance of the discussion or acknowledging the months of work I had invested in the project, the pattern began to repeat itself in increasingly uncomfortable ways, with Tyler adopting Morrison's habit of characterizing detailed analysis and thorough preparation as emotional responses rather than professional competence. During a discussion about budget projections, when I questioned some of the assumptions underlying a particularly optimistic forecast, Tyler dismissed my concerns by saying that I was getting too emotional about the numbers, and that we needed to focus on the bigger picture rather than getting bogged down in details. The phrase sounded foreign coming from his mouth, like dialogue from a script he had memorized, rather than thoughts he had developed through his own experience and reflection. I recognized the exact wording from a conversation I had overheard Morrison having with another colleague, where he had used the same dismissive language to shut down questions about the feasibility of an ambitious new initiative that had ultimately proven to be unrealistic. What struck me most about Tyler's transformation was how quickly he had internalized not just Morrison's vocabulary, but his entire approach to professional relationships, including the tendency to view collaboration as a zero-sum game where establishing dominance was more important than finding the best solutions to complex problems. The young man who had once eagerly sought feedback and guidance was now positioning himself as someone who no longer needed mentorship, someone who had outgrown the need for the kind of careful, methodical approach to learning that had characterized our working relationship. The frustration I felt was compounded by the recognition that Tyler's new behavior was not just personally hurtful, but professionally counterproductive, creating tension within the team and undermining the collaborative environment that had made our department successful. During what turned out to be our last one-on-one meeting, held in my office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while the rest of the building was quiet with the concentrated focus of people trying to meet end-of-month deadlines, Tyler made it clear that he no longer viewed me as a source of valuable guidance or professional development. When I attempted to discuss his recent performance and offer some constructive feedback about his presentation skills, he responded with a dismissive wave of his hand and told me that he had been getting some really valuable insights from Morrison about leadership and strategic thinking. The way he said Morrison's name, with a reverence that he had never shown for my own experience or expertise, made it clear that the balance of power in our professional relationship had shifted irrevocably, and that the loyalty I had believed was genuine had been nothing more than a temporary convenience that could be discarded when more advantageous relationships became available. The final confirmation of Tyler's transformation came when I overheard him describing me to a colleague as someone who was stuck in the old ways of doing things and who didn't really understand the direction the company was heading under Morrison's leadership. The conversation took place in the parking lot outside the office building, where I had gone to retrieve some files from my car, and Tyler was speaking to another male colleague in the same tone of casual dismissal that Morrison used when discussing female employees. The betrayal was complete not just because Tyler had adopted Morrison's biases and communication style, but because he had weaponized our professional relationship by characterizing my experience and expertise as outdated obstacles to progress rather than valuable resources for the organization. As I stood there in the humid evening air, listening to Tyler reduce months of mentorship and guidance to a few dismissive sentences, I realized that the professional environment had fundamentally changed in ways that went beyond simple personality conflicts or management-style differences. The young man I had invested so much time and energy in developing had not just changed his allegiances, but had actively turned against the very qualities that had made him successful in the first place. The loyalty that I had believed was genuine had revealed itself to be nothing more than a strategic calculation, something that could be abandoned as soon as more advantageous relationships became available. But the full implications of this transformation were still becoming clear as new dynamics began to reshape not just Tyler's behavior, but the entire culture of our workplace. The announcement came on a Wednesday morning in September, delivered through a company-wide email that landed in my inbox while I was reviewing quarterly performance reports in my office. The morning sun streaming through the blinds and casting long shadows across the stack of papers that represented months of careful analysis and documentation. The subject line read, "Organizational Changes, New Strategic Initiatives Team." And as I scrolled through the corporate language about exciting opportunities and enhanced collaboration, I found Tyler's name listed as the newest member of Morrison's inner circle, effective immediately. The professional environment that had once felt predictable and merit-based suddenly felt like quicksand, where years of experience and proven performance could be rendered irrelevant by the whims of a director who valued conformity over competence, and where the relationships I had thought were built on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence were revealed to be nothing more than temporary alliances that could be discarded without explanation or apology. What made the announcement particularly devastating was not just the promotion itself, but the complete absence of any prior communication or acknowledgement of the role one had played in Tyler's development and success within the organization. I had spent countless hours after regular business hours, sitting in the fluorescent-lit conference room with its worn carpet and mismatched chairs, helping Tyler understand complex client relationships and industry regulations, reviewing his presentations line by line, and sharing insights that had taken me years to develop through experience and careful observation. The investment I had made in his professional growth had been substantial and genuine, motivated by the belief that mentorship was one of the most important contributions senior employees could make to organizational success. But none of that history was reflected in the sterile corporate language that announced his advancement to Morrison's strategic team. The silence that followed the announcement was perhaps more telling than any conversation could have been, creating an atmosphere of awkward tension that permeated every interaction in the office for the remainder of that week. Tyler made no attempt to speak with me privately about the promotion, no effort to acknowledge the mentorship he had received, and no gesture that suggested he recognized the potential impact his advancement might have on our working relationship or the dynamics within our department. The professional environment that had once felt collaborative and supportive began to feel like a theater where everyone was performing roles they didn't quite understand, where the unspoken rules of engagement had been changed without notice, and where the investments people had made in building relationships and developing others were being systematically devalued by new leadership priorities. During the few interactions we had in the days following the announcement, Tyler displayed a remarkable ability to act as if our previous professional relationship had never existed, treating me with the same polite but distant courtesy he might show to any peripheral colleague rather than someone who had invested significant time and energy in his development. When we passed each other in the hallway outside the copy machine, he would offer a brief nod and continue walking, without stopping for the kind of informal conversation that had once been a regular part of our working relationship. The transformation was so complete that I began to question my own memory of our previous interactions, wondering if I had somehow misinterpreted the nature of our professional relationship, or overestimated the value of the guidance I had provided. The most painful aspect of Tyler's promotion was watching him embrace his new role with an enthusiasm that seemed to require actively distancing himself from his previous associations and commitments within the organization. During team meetings, he would reference insights and strategies that had clearly come from Morrison's management philosophy, presenting them as original thinking, rather than acknowledging their source or the process by which he had developed his understanding of these concepts. The confidence that had once seemed earned through hard work and careful learning was being replaced by a borrowed authority that felt hollow and performative, but which was clearly effective in impressing Morrison and securing Tyler's position within the new organizational hierarchy. As the weeks passed and Tyler settled into his new role, it became increasingly clear that his advancement represented more than just a career opportunity, but a fundamental choice about the kind of professional he wanted to become and the values he was willing to embrace or abandon in pursuit of success. The young man who had once spoken eloquently about loyalty and commitment had chosen to align himself with a leadership style that prioritized personal advancement over collaborative relationships, that valued conformity over integrity, and that treated previous mentorship and guidance as disposable resources rather than ongoing professional obligations. The betrayal was complete not because Tyler had been promoted, but because he had chosen to achieve that promotion by rejecting the very principles and relationships that had made his success possible in the first place. The afternoon I cleaned out my desk drawer and found the handwritten thank you note Tyler had given me after his first successful client presentation. I realized that the workplace I had believed in no longer existed, at least not in any form that I could recognize or respect. The note, written on company letterhead in Tyler's careful handwriting, expressed gratitude for my patience and guidance, and included a promise to always remember the lessons you've taught me about integrity and professional excellence. Reading those words months later, after watching Tyler systematically abandon every principle they represented, I understood that the professional environment had been fundamentally transformed, not just by Morrison's leadership style, but by the willingness of people like Tyler to sacrifice their stated values for the promise of advancement and recognition. But this realization was only the beginning of a much deeper understanding of how completely the culture of our workplace had been compromised. The systematic exclusion began so gradually that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, like trying to notice the slow change of seasons when you're living through them day by day, rather than stepping back to observe the larger transformation taking place around you. It started with email chains that had previously included me automatically being reorganized to exclude my input, conversations that had once flowed naturally through my office now being redirected to other channels, and decisions that had once required my approval or expertise being made without any consultation or notification. The professional environment that had once positioned me as an integral part of the decision-making process was being quietly restructured to minimize my involvement and influence, creating a sense of professional isolation that was both subtle and devastating in its systematic thoroughness. The first concrete sign of my diminishing role came when I discovered that weekly status reports, which I had been responsible for compiling and distributing for over 3 years, were now being handled by someone else without any official announcement or explanation. I only learned about the change when a colleague mentioned in passing that she hadn't received my usual Friday summary, leading me to investigate and discover that the responsibility had been quietly transferred to Tyler's new team without any transition period or acknowledgement of the expertise I had developed in organizing and presenting this information. The confidence I had built over years of reliable performance was being systematically undermined by a process that seemed designed to make me question my own value and relevance within the organization. During team meetings in the cramped conference room with its flickering fluorescent lights and the persistent smell of industrial coffee, I began to experience the strange phenomenon of being physically present, but functionally invisible, sitting at the same table where I had once been a respected voice in strategic discussions, but now finding myself excluded from conversations as if I were merely an observer rather than a participant. My colleagues would discuss projects and initiatives that directly impacted my areas of responsibility, without seeking my input or acknowledging my expertise, while Morrison and Tyler engaged in animated conversations about directions and priorities that would fundamentally affect my work but were being decided without my involvement. The frustration of being systematically marginalized was compounded by the professional courtesy that prevented me from directly confronting the situation, creating a psychological pressure that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The most telling example of my changing status came when I discovered that a new intern, Sarah Kim, who had been hired just weeks earlier, was being included in strategic planning sessions that I was no longer invited to attend, despite having years of experience with the projects being discussed and intimate knowledge of the client relationships that were central to the planning process. The realization that my institutional knowledge and proven expertise were being valued, less than the fresh perspective of someone with no experience in our industry, was both personally devastating and professionally bewildering, suggesting that the criteria for inclusion and influence had been fundamentally altered in ways that had nothing to do with competence or contribution. The loyalty I had shown to the organization over years of dedicated service was being repaid with systematic exclusion and marginalization that felt deliberately designed to push me toward the margins of relevance. The breaking point came during a presentation to potential new clients, held in the main conference room that had been hastily decorated with corporate banners and motivational posters that seemed designed to project success and confidence to visiting executives. I had spent weeks preparing background research and analysis for the presentation, developing insights and recommendations that drew on years of experience with similar clients and market conditions. But when the presentation began, I discovered that my contributions had been edited out entirely, and that Tyler was presenting strategies and recommendations that were largely based on my research, but attributed to Morrison's strategic vision and the fresh thinking of the new team. The betrayal was complete not just because my work was being used without attribution, but because the professional environment had been restructured to systematically exclude and undervalue the very expertise that had made the presentation possible. As I sat in that conference room, watching Tyler confidently present ideas that had originated from months of my careful analysis and research, I realized that the workplace I had believed in was not simply changing, but was being deliberately restructured to exclude certain voices and perspectives in favor of others, who were more aligned with Morrison's vision of organizational success. The competence and dedication that had once been valued were now being treated as obstacles to progress, while conformity and political alignment were being rewarded with increased responsibility and recognition. The frustration of being systematically marginalized was overwhelming. But what struck me most was the realization that this exclusion was not accidental or temporary, but represented a fundamental shift in how value and contribution were being measured and rewarded within the organization. The final confirmation of my marginalized status came when I was excluded from a department restructuring meeting, where decisions were being made about the future direction of projects I had initiated and developed over several years, with my role being discussed and redefined without my input or participation in the process. The meeting took place on a Friday afternoon in Morrison's office, behind closed doors while I sat at my desk just down the hallway, aware that my professional future was being decided by people who seemed to view my experience and expertise as liabilities rather than assets. The confidence I had built over years of successful performance was being systematically dismantled by a process that seemed designed to push me toward resignation rather than direct termination, creating a professional environment that was hostile in its indifference and devastating in its systematic exclusion of voices that had once been central to organizational success. But the full implications of this marginalization were still becoming apparent as the final phase of my workplace experience began to unfold. The decision to leave crystallized on a Monday morning in November, when I arrived at the office to find that my key card no longer provided access to the executive conference room where I had attended strategic planning meetings for over 4 years, and nobody had bothered to inform me that my access privileges had been revoked or explain why this change had been implemented. I stood there in the hallway outside the conference room, my hand trembling slightly as I repeatedly tried to swipe the card that had once opened every door in the building, while colleagues walked past me with uncomfortable expressions that suggested they knew something I didn't about my changing status within the organization. The humiliation of being locked out of spaces where I had once been a respected participant was compounded by the realization that this exclusion had been planned and implemented without any consultation or explanation, treating me like a security risk rather than a long-time employee who had contributed significantly to the organization's success. The process of cleaning out my office took place over the course of that same week, conducted in the early morning hours before most of my colleagues arrived, and during lunch periods when the building was relatively quiet, because I couldn't bear the thought of having conversations about my departure with people who had witnessed my systematic marginalization, but had remained silent throughout the process. Each item I packed into the cardboard boxes I had retrieved from the supply closet represented years of professional investment and personal commitment, from the framed certificates that documented my continuing education efforts to the thank you cards from clients who had appreciated my attention to detail and dedication to their success. The personal photographs on my desk, showing office celebrations and team achievements from better times, felt like artifacts from a different era, when the workplace had been defined by mutual respect and collaborative effort rather than political maneuvering and systematic exclusion. The silence that accompanied my departure was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire experience, creating an atmosphere where my colleagues seemed to have received instructions to treat my leaving as a non-event, rather than the departure of someone who had been an integral part of the organization for years. When I carried my boxes through the hallway toward the exit, the conversations that had been taking place in various offices suddenly stopped, as if my presence had become something to be endured rather than acknowledged, and the few colleagues who made eye contact offered weak smiles that seemed designed to minimize interaction rather than express genuine sentiment about my departure. The professional environment that had once felt like a community of people working towards shared goals had been transformed into a place where loyalty and connection could be severed without acknowledgement or ceremony. The final moments in my office were spent sitting in the chair where I had conducted countless meetings and phone calls, looking around at the empty shelves and bare walls that had once displayed evidence of my contributions and achievements, trying to reconcile the space with the memories of productive collaboration and meaningful work that had once defined my professional experience. The view from my window, overlooking the parking lot where I had arrived each morning with anticipation and purpose, now seemed to mock the investment I had made in believing that competence and dedication would be recognized and valued over the long term. The frustration of being systematically excluded and marginalized was giving way to a deeper sadness about the loss of professional relationships that had once seemed genuine, and the destruction of a workplace culture that had once supported growth and mutual respect. As I prepared to leave for the final time, I composed a brief email to my colleagues, thanking them for their collaboration over the years and wishing them success in their future endeavors. But the responses were sparse and perfunctory, with most people offering generic well wishes that seemed designed to close the conversation rather than acknowledge the significance of my departure or the circumstances that had led to it. The silence was particularly painful because it came from people who had once sought my advice and guidance, who had celebrated successes and weathered challenges alongside me, but who now seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge our shared history or express any genuine sentiment about my leaving. The betrayal was complete not just because of Tyler's transformation or Morrison's systematic exclusion, but because the entire professional environment had been restructured to treat loyalty and dedication as disposable commodities rather than foundational values. The walk to my car that final afternoon, carrying the last box of personal items from an office that had once felt like a second home, was conducted through a parking lot that seemed strangely quiet despite being full of vehicles belonging to colleagues who were continuing their work as if nothing significant had happened. The autumn air was crisp and clear, offering a contrast to the stale atmosphere of an office building where trust had been systematically eroded and relationships had been reduced to strategic calculations. But the sense of relief I expected to feel was overshadowed by the sadness of losing not just a job but a professional identity that had been built over years of careful investment and genuine commitment. The confidence that had once sustained me through challenges and setbacks had been systematically undermined by a process that seemed designed to make me doubt my own value and relevance. But as I drove away from the building for the last time, I began to understand that my departure represented not just an ending but the beginning of a different kind of professional journey. The final realization came as I sat in my car in the empty parking lot of a roadside diner several miles from the office, trying to process the emotions and implications of leaving a workplace that had once felt like home but had been transformed into something unrecognizable and hostile. The professional environment that had once rewarded competence and collaboration had been systematically restructured to prioritize conformity and political alignment, creating a culture where genuine mentorship and loyalty were not just undervalued, but actively punished through exclusion and marginalization. The betrayal I had experienced was not unique to my situation, but representative of a broader transformation that was affecting workplaces across the country, where the bonds of trust and mutual respect that had once defined professional relationships were being replaced by transactional interactions that treated people as disposable resources rather than valuable contributors to organizational success. That this understanding would prove to be the foundation for a different kind of wisdom about the nature of work and the importance of maintaining integrity, even in environments that no longer reward it. The months that followed my departure were filled with a complex mixture of anger, disappointment, and gradually emerging clarity about the nature of professional relationships and the dangerous naivety of believing that generosity and mentorship would naturally be rewarded with loyalty and gratitude in return. I spent countless evenings sitting on my front porch, watching the neighborhood settle into darkness while reflecting on the warning signs I had ignored and the assumptions I had made about Tyler's character and commitment to the values he had once expressed so eloquently during our early conversations. The betrayal had been particularly devastating because it had come not from a competitor or an obvious adversary, but from someone I had invested in personally and professionally, someone whose success I had celebrated as if it were my own achievement, and someone who had once spoken about loyalty and integrity as if they were fundamental principles rather than convenient talking points to be abandoned when more advantageous opportunities became available. The process of rebuilding my professional confidence required confronting some uncomfortable truths about my own role in creating the conditions that had made the betrayal possible, particularly my tendency to interpret gratitude and respect as indicators of genuine loyalty rather than recognizing them as temporary responses to immediate circumstances that could change as quickly as those circumstances evolved. I had operated under the assumption that investing in other people's success would create lasting bonds of mutual respect and professional obligation. But Tyler's transformation had taught me that mentorship and guidance were often viewed as stepping stones rather than ongoing relationships that carried reciprocal responsibilities and expectations. The frustration of realizing that my investment had been one-sided was compounded by the recognition that I had ignored clear signals about Tyler's character and priorities, choosing to see what I wanted to see, rather than acknowledging the evidence that suggested his commitment to stated values was superficial rather than genuine. The most important lesson that emerged from this experience was the necessity of establishing clearer boundaries and expectations in professional relationships, particularly when it comes to mentorship and career development, because the assumption that generosity will be met with gratitude and loyalty can create vulnerabilities that opportunistic individuals will exploit without hesitation or remorse. I realized that my approach to mentoring had been too trusting and too generous, offering guidance and support without requiring any demonstration of genuine commitment to the values and principles that I considered essential to professional success. The environment that had once seemed collaborative and supportive had been transformed by the introduction of individuals who viewed relationships as strategic assets rather than genuine connections. And my failure to recognize and adapt to this change had made me an easy target for manipulation and exploitation. During conversations with my daughter Emily, who was beginning her own professional journey as a recent college graduate, I found myself sharing insights about the importance of recognizing when professional relationships are based on mutual respect versus temporary convenience, and the necessity of protecting oneself from individuals who view mentorship and guidance as entitlements rather than privileges that carry corresponding obligations and responsibilities. The confidence that Emily displayed in her early career interactions reminded me of my own optimism when I had first entered the professional world, that I was determined to help her avoid the mistakes I had made by being too trusting and too generous with people who had not demonstrated genuine commitment to the values they claimed to embrace. The lessons I had learned through betrayal and disappointment were becoming the foundation for a different kind of professional wisdom, one that valued discernment and boundaries as much as generosity and collaboration. The perspective I gained from distance and reflection allowed me to see that Tyler's transformation had not been a sudden change of character, but rather the revelation of character traits that had always been present, but had been masked by the circumstances of our early relationship, when he had needed my guidance and support to establish himself within the organization. The young man who had spoken so eloquently about loyalty and commitment had been performing a role rather than expressing genuine convictions, and his willingness to abandon those stated principles as soon as more advantageous relationships became available had revealed the transactional nature of his approach to professional relationships. The betrayal had been painful not just because of its personal impact, but because it had forced me to confront the reality that the professional environment had changed in ways that made traditional values like loyalty and integrity less relevant than political skills and strategic thinking. The most profound realization that emerged from this experience was that Tyler's betrayal, while personally devastating, had actually provided me with valuable insights about the changing nature of workplace dynamics and the importance of adapting my approach to professional relationships to reflect contemporary realities rather than traditional expectations. The workplace that had once rewarded competence and dedication was being transformed by leaders like Morrison, who prioritized conformity and political alignment over actual performance and contribution, creating environments where success was increasingly determined by one's ability to navigate interpersonal dynamics rather than deliver results. The frustration I had felt about being systematically excluded and marginalized was giving way to a deeper understanding of how organizational cultures were being reshaped by individuals who viewed relationships as strategic assets, rather than genuine connections based on mutual respect and shared values. As I began to explore new professional opportunities, I carried with me a hard-earned wisdom about the importance of recognizing when workplace cultures have been compromised by individuals who valued advancement over integrity, and the necessity of protecting oneself from environments where loyalty and dedication were viewed as weaknesses rather than strengths. The confidence I had lost through betrayal and systematic exclusion was being rebuilt on a foundation of clearer boundaries and more realistic expectations about the nature of professional relationships in contemporary workplace environments. Tyler had taught me, inadvertently and painfully, that the most important professional skill in today's environment might not be technical competence or collaborative ability, but rather the discernment to recognize when organizations and individuals have abandoned the values they claim to embrace, and the courage to maintain one's own integrity, even when doing so comes at a personal and professional cost. But this wisdom would prove invaluable as I navigated the next phase of my career with a clearer understanding of how to protect myself while still contributing meaningfully to organizations that genuinely valued competence, dedication, and the kind of authentic professional relationships that had once defined the best aspects of workplace culture.